I'm very pleased to welcome Peter Baker, New York Times chief White House correspondent, along with New Yorker columnist Susan Glasser. They have nearly 60 combined years of Washington reporting. Their latest jointly written book is called The Divider, and it's a meticulous deep dive into the Trump administration, based not only on their time covering President Trump and candidate Trump, but also more than 300 original interviews, including 2 sessions with the former president himself. The Washington Post calls it the most comprehensive and detailed account of the Trump presidency yet published. And God knows there have been enough accounts, which leads me to my first question. Peter and Susan, were you worried that the world did not need yet another book about Donald Trump? And were you trepidatious about throwing your hat in a ring that is really pretty crowded by now?
Yeah. Well, thank you for having us. We appreciate that. We were a little trepidatious, because there are a lot of really good journalists out there who spend a lot of time looking at Donald Trump. And, will we be able to do anything to add to the record? But our book is a little different because it's about the 4 years of his presidency, the full 4 years. Nobody's taken on that before. And the point is that we can write a lot about January 6th, which is super important. But to understand January 6th, 2021, you really have to understand January 20th, 2017, and every day that came in between, because it was a culmination of a 4-year war on institutions of Washington and the United States. So we thought it was worth going back and doing something we felt is different than anybody else had done.
And we're going to talk about the damage to those institutions in a moment. But Susan, I'm just curious, as a fellow reporter, how difficult was it to get 300 people to spill the beans? I mean, I wonder if it was almost like a therapy session of sorts, and somewhat cathartic for some of these people who had been part of this pretty toxic environment, to just basically vomit out their feelings and everything they had witnessed.
Well, first of all, let me just say, as a historian and a journalist, I would appreciate a little bit more unburdening themselves of everything that happened, to be honest. But look, Katie, I think that it was an incredible, wild ride for the people who experienced this presidency from the inside. And also, there just were so many people. Remember that Donald Trump, in addition to his own kind of carnival show, he had basically a conveyor belt in and out of the White House and the cabinet, the likes of which we've really never seen. The turnover was just breathtaking. I was just reflecting the other day how, here we are nearly 2 years into the Biden presidency. There's none of this like crazy coming and going and, cabinet secretaries this week and scandals over senior officials the next week. Donald Trump was an outlier in many things, but there was a lot of potential sources for this book, Katie, because there were so many people who cycled in and out of his world.
But I do think you're right, though, that they did want to talk, right? I mean, that they were so eager, I think, to finally unload if they hadn't already. Some people came to our house and they sat there for hours just sort of unburdening themselves. In some cases, they were trying to reputation wash, right? They're trying to justify and explain and make people think better of them maybe than they had before. But I think in a lot of ways, it's just a way of talking about an experience that was so traumatic for them and trying to make sense of it themselves.
Well, that was really kind of a thread throughout the book, this feeling like, should we be on the inside where we can control this guy, or are we better off being on the outside because it's just too insane? Who are some of the characters you met who really exemplify that internal struggle?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the story in many ways writ large of the Trump presidency, right? Because without those enablers, and in many cases, the enablers were also the resistors, but then some of them were the facilitators. But without them, he's just another angry old dude shouting at the television, in between golf games, right? And so it's their story too. And, I think that for me, when you look at, first of all, the incredible unprecedented struggles between the White House and Donald Trump and the senior leadership of the U.S. military, that is a story that I think is more fully told and reported in this book than has been previously known. And it goes all the way back, by the way. There's a through line here. It's not just the catastrophic ending of the presidency in 2020 with Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, and his rift, very public rift, with Donald Trump, it actually goes all the way back to the very first encounters with what Trump calls my generals, Jim Mattis, the defense secretary, really almost hallowed retired four-star Marine general, John Kelly, another very eminent retired four-star Marine general who becomes his second White House chief of staff. Then you have H.R. McMaster, the brawny three-star Army general who becomes his second national security advisor. And by the way, is feuding to an extreme degree that we never appreciated until we did the reporting for this book, feuding to an extreme degree with Jim Mattis, the defense secretary, and John Kelly, and in a way that, of course, empowers Donald Trump. He is the divider. He divides his own aides. He divides his family. Of course, he exacerbates the divisions in the country. And that, to us, was a major theme.
You know, at the same time, he was kept from doing really outrageous things that he thought were within his purview, which to me indicates a complete lack of knowledge about the law, about ethics, about historical precedents, about the role of the president of the United States and what that individual is allowed to do. Were you shocked, Peter, how, I mean, to me, it indicated such ignorance about our existing institutions that it seemed almost unfathomable.
Yeah, exactly. One of his own aides told us he knew almost nothing about most things. That was the quote from his own aide. You're right. He didn't know about things. He asked aides at one point, well, how do I declare war? You know, he had no idea how a lot of these things
How do I
work.
get rid of this court? You know, how do I do this? How do I exact revenge on my enemies? How, you know, I mean, it's just insane.
Exactly. He wanted to use the institutions of government that were mainly the apolitical institutions like the law enforcement system and the military and the intelligence agencies and the healthcare industry to suit his own needs, his own goals and his own interests and his own political desires. And he didn't understand when people told him, no, you can't do that. It's either illegal or improper or inappropriate. And when they told him that, he simply tried to find other people who would go along.
Well, it's almost as if, Susan, he needed a tutor in the White House to actually give him the job description and what he was allowed to do as president of the United States. I mean, it just, I'm not shocked, but it was mind-boggling some of the ways in which he tried to exercise his power. And I guess you wonder, couldn't have someone sort of given him some kind of primer before he stepped into the Oval Office to say, I don't know. It's just crazy to me. Does that reveal just his lack of basic, not only knowledge of civics, but government experience?
Absolutely, Katie. But the truth is that they were fully prepared to give him a primer. He didn't want it. It's the combination of ignorance and arrogance that really sets Donald Trump apart. There have been presidents who were inexperienced before, who didn't know much, like Bill Clinton, about foreign affairs, or, you know, Barack Obama only had a few years of Washington experience as a junior senator under his belt. That's not what we're talking about here. And it is true that Donald Trump is the first and only president in American history who never served a single day in government or the military before becoming president. But again, they were prepared to tutor him, to sit down. There's this incredible scene in the book, the very first meeting with his top national security officials in the Situation Room in the White House. And the idea, in fact, is to do what you're talking about, to go around the world and to kind of fill in the new president on, here's the situation with Russia, here's the situation with China, here's the situation with Afghanistan. And the meeting was a disaster because Donald Trump had no intention of listening, no interest in listening. He was immediately, this is the very first Situation Room meeting, according to our reporting. You know what he was talking about? He was talking about how much money South Korea charged his hotels for their televisions in the first national security meeting of his presidency. It went so poorly that Reince Priebus, the hapless first chief of staff, said afterwards, he gathered a bunch of the participants. He said, we better go to my office and figure out what the hell just happened here. And they go to Priebus's office, and Joe Dunford, who is the four-star Marine general, who at that time was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he's actually trying to soothe everybody. And he has seen presidents up close since Bill Clinton. And, he was the only holdover with the Obama years. And he says, okay, guys, all right, don't panic. We'll be fine. We just need to get to know him, and we'll try to understand a little bit more what the Trump doctrine in foreign policy is all about. And Jared Kushner, in his early 30s at this time, obviously not much more experienced than Donald Trump himself, interrupts the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he says, yeah, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. That's not how this is going to work, guys. And the really remarkable thing, of course, is that Jared Kushner was absolutely right. Donald Trump was who he was. He was never going to change. And it was, Washington was just unprepared from day one for a president who had no interest. It wasn't that he was ignorant, it's that he didn't care.
And there were hopes, I think, that he would surround himself with people who had significant expertise and listen to those people, but that obviously did not come to be. And of course, your book talks about North Korea and Iran. Were those the most serious foreign policy suggestions that might have had just terrible consequences when it comes to foreign policy under President Trump?
Well, there's two good examples for sure. All this talk originally about fire and fury with North Korea really petrified some of the people around him, including John Kelly, the 4-star Marine general that Susan just mentioned, who was chief of staff. He was so worried that they would actually stumble into a nuclear war that he encouraged Trump to do the kind of diplomacy that he later did, the love affair he ultimately had with Kim Jong-un. That wouldn't have been exactly how John Kelly would have done it, but he felt it was better that the president tried to negotiate than to get into a war by accident. There are other examples. He always talked about trying to have missile strikes against, specific Iranian sites for which there was no justification to do it. And his military guys would tell him, we don't have the legal authority to do that. That would be a war crime if we did that. And that's the kind of thing he kept pushing.
Nothing surprises me at this point, but what was the most shocking thing you learned during your exhaustive reporting, talking to so many people? Or is it just honestly too hard to pick because there's so many?
Look, there's a lot of, just extraordinary moments. I mean, things like John Kelly having to consult, secretly purchasing a book about the dangerous case of Donald Trump and his narcissistic personality disorder in order to understand, the kind of wacky boss in the Oval Office. But look, in 3 decades of reporting in Washington, Katie, I have never experienced anything like when we found out and understood the true nature of the fears in late 2020 and early 2021 by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, that Donald Trump, really constituted the most serious national security threat to the country itself. This is totally uncharted territory. There was a meeting between Mark Milley and Mike Pompeo, perhaps one of the most obsequious of the Trump officials, right? The Secretary of State. Even Pompeo is so alarmed after the election when Trump is not conceding, and he fires the defense secretary on November 9th and installs this team of loyalists with a very murky agenda. Mike Pompeo comes rushing over to Mark Milley's house at Fort Myer at 9 o'clock at night, sits at his kitchen table and says, the crazies have taken over. We obtained in the course of reporting this book a document that just, in my view, it certainly has no precedent, which was the resignation letter that Mark Milley wrote but did not send to Donald Trump in the aftermath of that disastrous Lafayette Square photo op on June 1 of 2020. And in it, Mark Milley calls the president of the United States basically a grave and irreparable threat to the country. He says that he is ruining, quote unquote, the international order. He says he believes that Donald Trump does not, quote, subscribe to many of the values and principles that this country fought for in World War II. And again, we knew in a general sense, right, that there was this, fundamental conflict between Trump and the generals, but the language there is just so extraordinary,
Yeah. Well, I have to ask you about your 2 meetings at Mar-A-Lago, because I really wish I could have been a fly on the wall and just witnessed that, because I know Donald Trump a little bit, and he can be very sort of gregarious and charming. And I'm just curious sort of what his affect was, how you found him, and how, was he his sort of petty defensive self? I just am curious, like, did he try to schmooze you? Can you just describe what that was like, that whole experience?
He is, I mean, he's trying to be solicitous, right? Can I offer you a Coke? Would you like to sit here? He's trying to be like a hotel maitre d' in effect. And but you're right, the rest of the conversation then quickly devolves into name calling of people he doesn't like, people, most of them who work for him and broke with him in some fashion, insisting that the election was stolen when of course it wasn't. No matter what question you asked him, he kept bringing it back around to that topic because that's what he wanted to talk about. And for a historian or a journalist who's trying to write a book, a history, you realize he's not a reliable fact witness. You can't ask him what happened in this meeting, who said what decision was made, because he's not going to tell you the truth. You can't assume he's telling you the truth. At least the very first thing he told us in our first interview, he contradicted the very first thing he told us in his second interview. He sometimes contradicted himself within the same interview. At one point he says about January 6th, I wanted to go to the Capitol. Remember, after that rally, he told us this, I wanted to go to that Capitol with my protesters, but the Secret Service wouldn't let me. And then about 60 seconds later, he says, well, I never told the Secret Service that I wanted to do that. And then about 60 seconds later, he said again that the Secret Service wouldn't let him. I mean, he can't even stay consistent within the few minutes of an interview. So it's a really, for a journalist or a historian, I think it's kind of a perplexing and challenging environment to try to get something out of it.
You know, Katie, I've heard him described as charming before, and he certainly was not charming in our interactions with him. I was really struck by that because I was prepared for that possibility, right? And look, he's not like fire breathing, he's not shouting, he's not angry, right, in person. He's not that rally persona. But yet when you actually listen to what he's saying, it's sort of like a live action version of his Twitter feed, right? He was slinging insults at, random people, bringing up names just to insult them. Of course, lots of insults at Mitch McConnell. I think his caricature is so extreme, that almost any behavior has been called charming on his part. But, basically it struck me that he was really incapable of even uttering a straightforward sentence, right? Like this is a man who cannot have here's a noun and a verb and a period. I don't think there was a single period in the 3.5 hours that we spoke with him. It was basically a monologue in which we were occasionally interjecting, random subjects for him to try to muse upon.
Do you think he is in denial about all the trouble he's in? Does he feel, did he give I am invincible vibes off to you all? Or did you get a sense that he felt like the walls were kind of closing in on him?
There was a certain pathos, I would say, to Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Now, remember, we visited him in the spring of 2021 and then again in November of 2021. So as these latest round of investigations have metastasized, he was not yet feeling that. But to me, there was a pathos, right? That he was sort of seeking the crowd that had shrunken, to his paying customers, right? Like after our interview in the hotel lobby of Mar-a-Lago, where he's showing us off, he goes down and he entertains the crowd at a poolside fundraiser that his kids are sponsoring, right? And then he comes up to dinner, and this is like almost a nightly spectacle. They have his table behind a red velvet rope as if anyone's going to take it. And all the people interrupt their dinners and they stand up and they give him a standing ovation. And he waves to them as if it's a crowd of thousands and it's like a small handful of paying customers. So there was an element of pathos, but I recognize that the political moment, has shifted again.
Yeah. And we saw him in November of last year, before some of the investigations really took on the intensity that they have in the last few months. But I mean, in general, I wouldn't say this from the interview specifically, but in general, I think that he does feel like he has gotten away with so many things before. He has gotten out of so many different traps. In a way, he's kind of a political Houdini, as somebody just put it, and therefore assumes he can always get out of it. But he may not be able to this time. We'll see what happens.
And I wanted to ask you one thing about your book has gotten incredible reviews, but the New York Times actually said, the good old New York Times, Peter, they did wonder if you had given Donald Trump enough credit for the accomplishments he had during his administration, and that some critics might wonder if in fact this book, I'm paraphrasing, was too negative. And I'm curious to hear your response to that.
Well, look, I think we do talk about his accomplishments, but I think that the most important thing that makes him an outlier, makes him so unique in history, is this idea that he was trying to upend the traditions and norms that we've had for 246 years, particularly since the Watergate era. And I think that that's just the larger story. So I think that rather than get into a debate about the economy and, how much of a role any particular president has, and it wasn't the greatest economy ever, no matter how much he said it was, but it was a pretty good economy. I think rather than get into that kind of a back and forth, I think it was more important to talk about what makes him unique and what makes him consequential in American history. Every president has an economy that's either good or bad, but this is the only one to try to overturn a democratic election. And how did that happen?
Yeah, my mom used to say the president doesn't make the economy makes the president. Who knows? But you all talk about how damaged institutions are in the wake of the Trump phenomenon and presidency and the aftermath of the presidency, because obviously the notion that the election wasn't, was rigged has continued for some time, and still I think is very much alive in a lot of people in the Republican Party. I guess the question I wanted to ask you, has Donald Trump done irreparable damage to these institutions? What is the long-term impact on what he's done to government, to, all the branches of government, to journalism, honestly, by degrading and debasing journalists on a daily basis, to the courts? Do you think America can get its act together again, given what Donald Trump did?
Katie, I think this is the key question. This is the key question. However, we don't know how the story ends. And until we know how the story ends, it's very hard to know what the lasting impact is going to be. I will say this, Donald Trump revealed in an extraordinary way the weaknesses and liabilities and fault lines and fissures and the potential even more catastrophic weaknesses in our institutions. We never even knew that January 6th, a purely ceremonial occasion for celebrating the peaceful transfer of power in a democracy, could be weaponized on behalf of one individual who didn't like the results of the election, right? That was a vulnerability hitherto unseen that Donald Trump pointed out, going directly after state election officials, again, by the president of the United States, literally picking up the phone and doing that. That was the kind of vulnerability that we never saw. And in many cases, by the way, what it showed is that if not for this or that individual, a relatively small number of individuals, a vice president here, a secretary of state there, we would have been in a very, very different outcome. So I would say that the legacy that we know for sure is that Donald Trump has revealed a large number of previously unseen weaknesses in our institutions that, if it's not addressed, is going to be very dangerous. And then on the international stage, because this is really important, he has undercut the perception of American power in ways that I find will be almost impossible for a future president to overcome unless we really recoup into a much more bipartisan foreign policy very quickly, because every despot in the world, Vladimir Putin included, can simply say, well, I'll wait out, the United States, and in 4 years or 2 years, we'll just get a totally different policy. Who's going to trust the word of the United States when Barack Obama makes a nuclear deal and Donald Trump throws it back out? And that applies, by the way, even to Joe Biden. He said, we're back. But if the Democrats lose the House and potentially the Senate in this fall's election and lose the White House again, and the policy shifts again, what kind of a superpower can we possibly be on the world stage?
And you see actually sort of the semblance of Trumpism. I mean, the United States isn't the only country that is suddenly going far to the right with this populist anti-immigration fervor. We just saw it in Italy, for example, in Hungary, in Venezuela. I mean, this is happening everywhere. So this isn't just an American problem. But speaking of America, one of the most disturbing things, and this will be my last question, so you all can take a break before what you're doing tonight. They're little mini Trumps. He actually provided a blueprint for the behavior and the strategy. And I think the sort of unbridled and dangerous populism that we're seeing pop up in all these state elections. And to me, that's another sort of legacy of the Trump administration. Do you see that happening, Peter? And is it disturbing to you that they're all following, many are following in his footsteps, and those who aren't are being penalized?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. He's blown the barriers off the system in a way that didn't exist before, right? People are watching him and realizing that they can get away with things that otherwise they would never do. In fact, some of them are even going further than him. This stunt by Governor DeSantis of sending migrants to Massachusetts is something that Donald Trump talked about doing, but never actually did. He said, well, we should just dump them on these sanctuary cities, Trump once said, but he never actually did it. And in this case, obviously, Governor DeSantis has actually taken it one step further and gone ahead and done it and seen this as a political plus and gotten a political benefit out of it in his view. So I think that you're right. He's created precedents there that are being applied by the ones who would like to follow in his footsteps. Not
to mention in civil discourse everywhere. Well, Susan Glasser and Peter Baker, the book is called The Divider, Trump in the White House, 2017 to 2021. Do you see a volume 2 happening? Now, you guys must be pretty sick of the subject, but there are a lot of question marks about the future, whether or not he will be a candidate for 2024. What will happen with all these investigations? Are you done officially with Donald J. Trump?
The question is whether Donald J. Trump is done with us, isn't it, Katie? We are not planning on a sequel at this time.